They thought they were alone, just two people trying to smile through another day of absence. Another photo, without a minute. But behind them, in the space where memories live and prayers wait to be answered, something impossible was happening. What they didn't know, couldn't know, was that the camera was about to capture more than just their face, as it was about to freeze the exact second when hope stopped being a word and became flesh and blood. And here, standing 3 feet behind them while they posed for a picture believing their son was still oceans away. Here's what nobody tells you about military families. You don't just survive deployment, you perform survival. You smile for photos, you celebrate holidays with one chair empty. You fold the uniform and leave the boots by the door like shrines to someone who might not come back. You learn to live with absence, the way other people live with certainty, and you get so good at pretending you're okay that even you start to believe it. But every single military parent knows this truth that keeps them up at night. Duty and love aren't supposed to be enemies, but they feel like it when your child chooses honor over safety. When sacrifice stops being abstract and becomes the calendar on your wall marking days until maybe, possibly, hopefully, homecoming. What if everything you thought you knew about goodbye was actually preparing you for the hello you'd stopped letting yourself imagine? What if the hardest part of deployment isn't the leaving, it's the returning? The moment when your brain has to catch up to what your heart already knows, when time itself has to bow down and make space for love that refused to stay oceans apart. This isn't just another military homecoming story. This is about the second when the world stops turning, when shadows become real, when two parents turn around and find out that hope wasn't lying to them after all, it was just waiting for the perfect moment to prove that sometimes, just sometimes, the mission ends exactly the way it's supposed to, with boots on familiar ground, with the uniform still breathing, with a flag on the table, witnessing a miracle that looks like nothing more than a son standing behind his parents in silence, until they turn around. They stood there like they'd done 100 times before, shoulders close but never quite touching the emptiness between them. The mother adjusted her husband's collar with trembling fingers, a gesture she'd perfected over 32 years of marriage, while he held the phone at arm's length, squinting at the screen like it held answers instead of pixels. They were trying to smile, not the kind that reaches your eyes, but the kind you wear when you're convincing yourself that normal still exists. The living room behind them told a different story. The uniform folded on the chair hadn't moved in 6 months, its creases sharp as the day he'd left, and his boots by the door still carried dust from a driveway goodbye that felt like yesterday and forever ago, all at once. This photo wasn't about capturing a moment. It was about filling the silence that deployment leaves behind, the kind that echoes louder than any goodbye ever could. See, when someone you love is oceans away on a mission that doesn't promise tomorrows, you learn to perform normalcy like it's a duty in itself. You take photos on birthdays, holidays, random Tuesdays, anything to prove to yourself that life keeps moving even when your heart's been holding its breath for months. The father had his arm around his wife's waist, but his grip was loose, uncertain, like he'd forgotten how to hold on to something that wasn't slipping away. She leaned into him anyway, because that's what you do when duty and love become the same unbearable weight. They were smiling at a camera, but really they were staring down the barrel of another day without hearing his voice. Another night, setting 3 plates and removing one before anyone noticed. The flag on the table behind them, folded with precision, gifted at his deployment ceremony, caught the afternoon light like it was trying to remind them of honor, of sacrifice, of all the words that sound noble until they become your daily reality. What they didn't know, couldn't know, was that behind them, in the space where memory lives and breath holds still, something was about to shift. The phone's timer was counting down 10 seconds, 9, 8, and in those final moments before the shutter clicked, they were still inside their carefully constructed world of waiting. She'd whispered smile under her breath, the way she always did, as if speaking it softly made the pretending hurt less. He'd straightened his back, military straight, out of habit, even though he'd never served a day. Just loved someone who did with a fierceness that felt like its own kind of orders. And there, in that fraction of time before everything changed, they were just two people trying to prove they were okay, trying to believe their son was still half a world away, safe in the distance that kept them awake at night. But the arrow was already beginning to know what they didn't. There's a thickness that settles into a room, right before everything changes, like the atmosphere itself is holding its breath, waiting for permission to exhale. The living room had that weight, not oppressive, not obvious, just present in the way dust floats through afternoon sunlight without ever quite landing. The mother felt at first, though she couldn't name it, a subtle pressure against her chest that had nothing to do with the photo pose or the forced smile. It was the kind of calm that shows up uninvited right before storms, before phone calls in the middle of the night, before the knock on the door that every military family dreads but never talks about. She dismissed it as anxiety, as the usual knot that lived permanently between her ribs since the day her son signed those papers and traded his childhood bedroom for a bunk on a base she couldn't pronounce. But this wasn't anxiety, was something quieter, something that knew more than she did. The father felt it too, in his own way. Though men like him aren't supposed to admit when the air tastes different, he'd paused for just a second before raising the phone, his arm suspended mid-motion like his body was trying to tell him something his mind refused to hear. The house had been filled with this particular silence for months to kind, where every creak of the floorboards sounds like footsteps that never arrive, where you stop mid-sentence because you swear you heard his voice calling from upstairs. But this silence was different. Pregnant with something he couldn't name, something that made the hairs on his forearms stand up despite the warmth of the room. He'd learned not to trust hope during deployment. Hope was dangerous. Hope set you up for the fall. So he pushed the feeling down and focused on the camera, on the smile, on anything but the strange electricity humming just beneath his skin. The flag on the table seemed to catch more light than it should, its red stripes almost glowing, as if honor itself was trying to whisper a secret he wasn't ready to hear. What neither of them understood was that calm like this doesn't arrive randomly. It's earned. It's orchestrated. It's the universe's way of giving you one last breath before joy shatters you completely. Outside, a car door had closed with the softest click, careful and deliberate, the sound swallowed by the heavy air before it could reach their ears. Inside, the uniform folded on the chair seemed to lean forward slightly, though no breeze moved through the room, as if the fabric itself remembered the body it once held. The countdown on the phone continued 765, and in those seconds, the calm deepened, thickened, became almost tangible, like you could reach out and touch the waiting itself. She adjusted her hair one more time. He tightened his grip on her waist, and neither of them noticed how the shadows in the room had started to shift, how the air had begun to make space for something Sue and who'd been traveling toward this moment for longer than the flight home could measure. Memory doesn't always arrive as thoughts, as it comes as presence, as weight, as the outline of something your heart recognizes before your eyes can confirm. Behind them, in the space where the living room opened into the hallway, a shadow began to separate itself from the others, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who's rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times, across 1,000 sleepless nights. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't sudden, it was slow, intentional, the kind of movement that belongs to someone who's learned patience in the hardest classroom there is. His boots made no sound against the carpet, each step measured like he was still following orders, still on mission. But this time, the objective wasn't strategy or survival, it was love, pure and simple, waiting to be delivered. The shadow stretched longer as he moved into the light, and if they'd turned right then, if they'd broken their pose for even a second, They would have seen what their hearts had been aching for since the day deployment turned their family photos into a before and after story. But they didn't turn, couldn't turn, because the phone's timer had them locked in position, frozen in their performance of okayness, while behind them, their son materialized like an answer to prayers they'd stopped whispering out loud. He'd lost weight, the kind that comes from duty and sacrifice, eating away at everything that isn't essential, and his eyes carried stories he'd probably never tell. Things that happen when honor demands more than anyone should have to give. Yet standing there, 3 feet behind his parents who believed he was still oceans away, his face held something softer than any combat zone could touch. Pure, unfiltered anticipation. His hands hung at his sides, fingers twitching slightly like they were remembering every hug they'd been denied, every handshake that had to suffice when what he really needed was to be held like he was still their little boy. The uniform he wore now wasn't folded on a chair, it was alive, breathing, carrying him home in a way that transcended geography and made the living room feel both impossibly small and infinitely sacred. What makes a shadow become real isn't just light and physics, it's intention. It's the weight of presence that says, I'm here. I made it. I'm standing behind you, because in front would have ruined the surprise we all deserve after this kind of waiting. He could see the back of his mother's head, hair grayer than when he'd left, pulled back in the same style she'd worn his entire life, the one that said, I'm holding it together even when I'm not. He could see his father's shoulders, broader than his own but somehow smaller now, carrying the invisible burden of worry that never quite lifts when your child is in harm's way, following orders that could rewrite your family tree with one wrong step. The countdown continued. 4, 3, 2, and in that shrinking space between moments, he was both the boy who used to run through this house, leaving muddy boot prints, and the man who'd learned that homecoming isn't just a date on a calendar. It's a miracle wrapped in camouflage, standing behind the people who taught you that duty and love aren't opposites. They're the same thing, wearing different uniforms. The camera clicked, and in that microsecond of digital capture, everything that had been carefully balanced began to tip. They heard it first, not footsteps, not breathing, but something more primal. The sensation of being watched by someone who knows every freckle on your neck, every sigh you make when you think no one's listening. The mother's smile faltered first, her muscles recognizing something her brain refused to process, and she started to turn with the kind of slow-motion inevitability that belongs to moments too big for ordinary time. Her husband felt her body shift against his and followed her gaze, his arm dropping from her waist as his phone nearly slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers. And then they saw him, their son, their boy. Their soldier standing there in full uniform, like he'd been conjured from every prayer they'd whispered into the dark, every deployment calendar they'd crossed off with trembling hands, every flag on the table they'd stared at, wondering if Anna was worth this particular sacrifice. The world didn't just stop, it shattered into 1,000 tiny eternities, each one holding a different goodbye they'd survived. There was the first goodbye at the recruitment center, when he was 18 and immortal and they were terrified and proud in equal measure. There was the goodbye before basic training, all awkward hugs and see you zooms that everyone knew might become see you nevers if the mission went sideways. There was the deployment goodbye 6 months ago, the one that lasted too long and not long enough, where his mother had clung to his uniform like she could keep him safe through sheer force of grip, where his father had shaken his hand because real men don't cry except they do. They absolutely do when their son is heading toward orders that don't promise homecoming. Every single one of those goodbyes played simultaneously in the space between recognition and reaction, a highlight reel of love and letting go that made the air itself feel sacred. His boots by the door, the ones they'd kept exactly where he'd left them, suddenly made sense again, like they'd been holding space for this moment all along. But here's the thing about goodbyes. that most people don't understand until they've lived through the military. Can they accumulate, they compound, they build up like interest on a debt you never asked to. The mother's hand flew to her mouth, not to contain a scream, but to hold in every sob she'd swallowed over 6 months of pretending to be strong. Every night she'd fallen asleep to the sound of silence where his laughter used to echo. The father's face did something complicated. 1,000 emotions fighting for real estate on features that had been practicing stoic for half a year. And his eyes, God, his eyes filled with tears that carried the weight of every worry, every news report about casualties. Every time the phone rang and his heart stopped until he heard it wasn't that call, the one that turns flags into funeral gifts. And their son, standing there watching his parents remember every goodbye while realizing this was hello. This was homecoming. This was duty and love colliding in a living room that suddenly felt too small for this much feeling. He smiled, just barely, the kind of smile that says, I'm here. I made it. We survived this together, even when we were oceans apart. Time doesn't bow easily. It's relentless, indifferent, marching forward, whether you're ready or not, whether you're saying hello or goodbye or drowning in the space between. But right there, in that living room where a family had learned to breathe around an absence, time did something it rarely does. It surrendered. It bent backward, folded in on itself, created a pocket universe where nothing existed except 3 hearts remembering how to beat in the same room again. The mother's knees buckled first, not from weakness but from the sheer relief of carrying weight she could finally set down. And her son moved forward instinctively, catching her before she fell the way he'd been trained to catch people. Tosaba people, except this time it wasn't Dutiet, was coming home to the arms that had held him first, before the uniform, before the mission, before sacrifice became a word he understood in his bones. Her hands found his face, trembling fingers tracing features she'd memorized through photographs and video calls that never quite captured the realness of skin and warmth. And here, he's actually here. The father stood frozen for one more heartbeat, his brain still trying to reconcile the impossibility of his son being oceans away and standing right in front of him. Simultaneously, like deployment had somehow bent the rules of geography just for this moment. Then something broke inside him, not shattered, but opened, like a dam that had been holding back 6 months of tears. He wasn't supposed to cry because men in his generation learned that honor means suffering in silence. He crossed the distance in 2 steps and wrapped his arms around both of them, creating a circle that had been broken since the day his son chose duty over staying safe, chose orders over easy, chose to wear the uniform that now pressed against his chest in a 3-way embrace that felt like forgiveness and pride and thank God, your home, all mixed into one. His boots by the door would finally have company again. The uniform folded on the chair could rest, knowing its owner had returned. And the flag on the table, that symbol of everything they'd sacrificed, suddenly represented something different. Not loss, but love that survives distance, danger, and the brutal arithmetic of deployment math. In that frozen second, nothing else mattered, not the phone that had clattered to the floor. Still recording, capturing tears that would be watched and rewatched until the battery died. Not the neighbors who might wonder about the sound of sobbing mixed with laughter filtering through the walls. Not even the stories he'd eventually tell or wouldn't tell about what happened over there. About the missions that turned boys into men and men into ghosts who sometimes make it home. All that mattered was this: a mother's hands refusing to let go, a father's shoulders shaking with relief he'd been too afraid to hope for, and a son who'd traveled thousands of miles just to stand in this exact spot, proving that homecoming isn't a destination on a map. It's the moment when duty and love stop being at war with each other and finally become the same thing. Time bowed because love demanded it. Because some moments are too sacred to rush through. Because when you've spent half a year believing your child is oceans away and suddenly he's standing behind you in silence until you turn around, the universe owes you at least 1 second that lasts forever. So here's what I need you to understand. I mean really understand. Not just nod along and forget 5 minutes from now. Every single day you have with the people you love is a deployment in reverse. You're not waiting for them to come home, they're already here, standing behind you while you're busy posing for a life you think you're supposed to be living. How many moments have you missed because you were looking at a screen instead of turning around? How many times has someone you love been standing in the shadows of your attention, waiting for you to notice them before it's too late, before duty calls them away, before goodbye stops being temporary and becomes permanent? This father and mother spent 6 months mastering the art of absence, and in one frozen second they remembered what presence feels like. But you don't have to wait for deployment to teach you that lesson. You don't need your kid to be oceans away to realize that every hug you're too busy for, every conversation you're too distracted to have, every moment you postpone because you think you've got time, those are the real casualties of a life lived on autopilot. The uniform folded on the chair, the boots by the door, the flag on the table, these aren't just symbols in someone else's story. They're reminders that honor and sacrifice aren't exclusive to the military. They belong to anyone brave enough to turn around and actually see the people standing behind them, waiting to be remembered, waiting to matter more than whatever else you thought was important. So, let me ask you something, and I want you to sit with this question until it makes you uncomfortable. Who's standing behind you right now that you haven't turned around to see? What homecoming are you missing because you're too convinced that love will always wait for you to be ready? Because here's the truth that no one wants to admit: time doesn't bow to love nearly as often as we need it to. Most of the time, it just keeps moving, keeps taking, keeps turning hellos into goodbyes while you're still figuring out how to pay attention. But you can change that right now. Today, you can put down whatever's distracting you, turn around, and choose to be present for the people who've been deployed to the shadows of your life, waiting for their own homecoming in your awareness. If this story grabbed you by the heart and reminded you what actually matters, then do something about it. Don't just feel moved, move. Call someone you've been meaning to call. Show up for someone who's been showing up for you in silence. Turn around before you have to spend 6 months wishing you had. And if you want more stories that cut through the noise and remind you what it means to be human, to love hard, to honor the moments that matter, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because we're not here to waste your time with content that evaporates the second you scroll past it. We're here to build something that lasts. Just like the love between a soldier and the family that never stops waiting for him to come home. So, what's it gonna be? You gonna keep posing for a life you're not fully living? Or you gonna turn around and see what's been standing behind you all along?